What is it about the Republican psyche that is so strange, so perhaps twisted, that it embraces the accusations of the other side, applying a double standard to itself? There is no evidence, Andy McCarthy writes, much less proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that Trump intended to instigate the Battle of Capitol Hill. First of all, I think this is a ridiculous phrase, the Battle of Capitol Hill, really, Andy. But nevertheless, he says, look, Trump didn't instigate it. He did not want anyone to be physically injured, let alone killed. And then he goes on to say, moreover, that Trump didn't even call for people to storm the Capitol. Trump merely talked about people coming to Washington, getting fired up. I'm going to quote some of Trump's own words a little bit later. But as this article moves on, it seems to be moving toward well, Trump may not have the numbers, but there's no basis for this. But Andy McCarthy concludes that Trump should resign. And this is really what gave me a little bit of a body blow, because I respect Andy McCarthy, and I was thinking to myself, wait a minute. You too, Andy? Et tu, Andy? As Caesar said to Brutus, really? Why? Let's take what Trump did by your own account. Trump engaged in irresponsible demagoguery. He got people stoked up, and those people then, out of an overabundance of enthusiasm, some of them did some bad things. Let's just switch it up. Let's say the position was exactly the same, but it was Obama. Obama got people fired up, and these people began to march on the Capitol, and some of them entered the Capitol. We'll get into how. Do you see Andy McCarthy demanding that Obama resign? No. So what I'm getting at here is I understand that the left is jumping on this. It's a moment of opportunity. They're salivating over it. We finally can drive the stake into Trump. And in my opinion, this driving the stake into Trump is really aimed at 2024. They want to make sure he can't run again. That's the point of the impeachment. It is to drive a stake into Trump in such a way that he is ultimately banished to the outer sectors, to pariah status in American political life. They're scared of Trump. They're scared of Trump in a way that they have never been scared of another Republican. They weren't even this scared of Reagan, and they were plenty scared of Reagan. So the question I want to raise, and I might only end up raising it, have to dive into it more, is why are Republicans buying into this? What is it about the Republican psyche that is so strange, so perhaps twisted, that it embraces the accusations of the other side, applying a double standard to itself? This is a real mystery, and we can't really just let it go. We have to dive into it. So I do that. I want to comment on conservative and Republican psychology, because it's a little dismaying to see, first of all, conservatives, dyed-in-the-wool conservatives like Andy McCarthy, calling for Trump to resign, railing against Trump, with genuine indignation. That's not feigned. This is not somewhat strategic. And it's not just McCarthy, it's the National Review by and large. It's the conservative think tanks, which are sort of, if they're not outraged, they're deathly silent. It's the Republican elected leaders who are silent. So what's going on with these people? Now, I think in some cases, and I think this applies to Andy McCarthy, the right is the law and order party. McCarthy was a former prosecutor, so they have very low tolerance for any kind of lawbreaking. And I would say that this kind of virtue extends to such a point that they're willing to impose a double standard on their own side. They're willing to say, we must hold ourselves to a higher standard. It doesn't matter if the left stormed the Supreme Court. It wouldn't matter if they did it. But if we do it, we have no tolerance for it. We should know better. We're the better people. And this is a constant refrain on the right, and one that actually bears careful examination. How do you get into a fight with another side where you hold yourself to a different standard than the other side, and you knife members of your own side for falling short of those standards that the other side gleefully has to do little more than point out to you? That's the first issue I just want to raise here. I think there's a deeper psychology, though, and that is that the Republicans, in a sense, have become content to have a party in which certain privileges are distributed and no new people come in. In other words, for the traditional Republicans, the MAGA types are not only expanding the ranks, but changing the rules. I've grown up with these traditional Republican types, particularly the type of young writers that populate the think tanks and the sort of Washington Republican establishment. You got to realize who these guys are. They came to DC right out of Princeton or Tufts when they were 18 years old. They've been writing op-eds, and then they ate too much linguine and drank too much wine, and now they're overweight and they're disillusioned, but they've sort of become swamp creatures. They like DC. But the rules of the game have changed on them. They look around and they suddenly realize the center of gravity in the Republican Party has moved toward the Trumpsters. Trump is the one who electrifies the crowd and none of them. Even on the writer front and the social media front, you have these guys who have like 4,500 followers on Twitter, and they see a newcomer like Terrence Williams, some guy who, wow, that guy didn't even go to college. Wow, that guy came out of an orphanage. He's got 600,000 followers on Twitter. He's doing comedy shows and filling crowds. And when I show up to speak, basically everyone asks, who is that guy on the podium? So there is a tremendous amount here, I think, of that very ugly human quality, just sheer envy, cultural superiority, snobbery, embarrassment, directed at these new Trumpsters. Who's Candace Owens? What do her degrees come from? What gives her the right to speak from? What think tank has she paid her bona fides in? And so on, and so on, and so on. So there's a lot of this kind of scrabble going on the right. And I think ultimately the Republican Party will really need to find a way forward in all this. Why? Because we need traditional Republicans. I don't think the Republican Party can be only MAGA. People say 75 million people voted for Trump. No. 75 million people voted for Trump because he's a Republican. 75 million people would not have voted for Trump if he ran on an independent ticket. MAGA needs the traditional Republican Party. We can't have a party that's solely a party of the working class. We need the suburbs. We need the Georgia suburban soccer mom and housewife. We don't want to alienate that person. But conversely, traditional Republicans don't have enough to win either. They need the Trumpsters. So there's a lot of work to be done in thinking through and figuring out how do we create a new sense of going forward for the Republican Party.